carp, like the ones that you can see here today, are very varied feeders. They're omnivorous, which means that they are happy to eat other animals like bugs, invertebrates, worms, other fish in some cases, but they also will forage in amongst the weeds and eat algae and stuff like that. So today we're going to take a look at the 20 best carp baits, where to use them and how to get the best out of them. Here we have a beautiful selection of carp food. Humans also eat bread, but in my opinion, the best place for bread is on your hook when you're stalking. The great thing about bread is that you can use the crust on the surface, but you can also take the white soft stuff on the inside, squeeze it a little bit, and it will begin to sink. When you're choosing what bread to use, I would stay away from like the brown seeded breads and instead try and find a soft white, thickly sliced. All these ones that are cut really thin, the pieces of bread are too small, they don't bind on the hook very well. So in my opinion, you can't beat Hovis thick white sliced bread. Okay, next up is Spam, a very popular bait for fishing in murky water. Because it's full of oils and fats, I think it attracts the fish really well. I'm trying to find it here, but I can't see any. Oh, that's what, no. This is a video about carp baits, not my favorite drinks. Okay, there we are, Spam. Normally, there are larger tins available, which are better value for money. The other thing is that it's not very resilient, so it's best used when you're pole fishing or float fishing, for example, rather than hair rigging it and leaving it out on a carp rig overnight. You'd definitely be waking up in the morning with a bait that's probably fallen off if you were to leave this bait out for long periods of time. However, if you're chopping this up into small chunks or mushing it up and feeding it into your swim, and you want a more resilient hook bait that will stay on your hair rig for many hours at a time, that's where Pepperami comes into play. Here we are. Thankfully they have the good one, the red one, because there's two different types of Pepperami, the green and the red. This one isn't spicy and actually isn't even that tasty. I think, to be honest, if you like to eat this over this, you're just wrong. Pepperami is one of the only baits that I take fishing with me and often don't end up actually using because it's just too good and I end up eating it myself before I get a chance to put it on the rig. Pepperami has caught me so many carp, especially from quite pressured waters where lots of other people are fishing with boilies. When the carp are just starting to spook off of boilies or not really respond to them so well, a little chunk of spicy sausage just seems to unlock some places, especially in the winter. I'm gonna put these back though, because I don't want to end up spending all my money on a random selection of fishing bait. I've got enough already, and also I'm on a budget because I'm saving for something special. Sweet corn, definitely my weapon of choice. When I'm traveling anywhere around the world, carp just like eating sweet corn. I don't understand why. It's not something that a fish would ever find in its natural habitat or environment, but I've been to America, I've been to Europe, I've been to Japan, I've been to Australia, and everywhere that you throw sweet corn out, carp seem to eat it. The frozen bags are much better value for money than the tins. However, the tins have got a better average size, like the pieces of corn are larger and they're more resilient. So if you're just putting corn on the hook, I would advise grabbing yourself a tin. Also, if you want it to last a long time, you want to leave it in the back of your car just in case, the tins are a great option. However, if you're baiting en masse or you're throwing out quite a lot, these frozen bags, much better value for money. Now, prawns are an interesting one. They're quite expensive compared to some of the baits we've spoken about. Nearly dropped it so far. I've used prawns quite a lot actually when I'm fishing for large perch, and it's surprising the number of times that I've had a bite and it's ended up being a carp. This isn't something that I use all the time, but if I was needing to present something different, maybe I was float fishing or stalking, prawns would definitely be something I'd consider. However, at that price, there's probably better options. And whilst you're here buying your carp bait, this shop is actually incredible because you can also get a meal deal. That's where it's at, Cal.
No, I like to be different, try different foods, Carl. I haven't tried a chicken peanut satay.
mixers. These, whoa, that's a big bag, are floating dog food. The mixers are the ones which are sort of round in shape and just the right size to feed on the surface when surface fishing for carp. They are a great bait for getting the fish feeding before you then introduce maybe a bread hook bait or fish with a pop-up on the hook. They're priced well, you can feed lots of them, normally putting them in a spom if you're putting them out at long range or catapulting at shorter ranges, but all round probably the #1 surface bait for carp. We were supposed to be filming a video about carp bait, but do they have any carp here today? Brown coloured guy is kind of cool.
It is cool. George is no longer with us. Oh. One of the main people, one of the main fish.
Oh, fish?
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about your granddad.
No. George and Lenny was our first 2 fish, and George is now in fish heaven.
See you later, guys. I'll come and rescue you one day when I've got loads of ponds and stuff that you can all go and live your lives in. We're now at the tackle shop where we're going to find the last baits of this video and probably some of the most important ones too. Now that we're in the tackle shop, we're going to start finding some more specialist baits for carp fishing, such as particles. Now, particle baits is the word used to describe baits where you get lots and lots of small seeds, beans, pulses or nuts, which can, in many cases, provide the carp with an amazing food source, and on certain lakes it will really produce a lot of bites. Many people like to mix a selection of different particles together to create a sort of grubbing around mix where fish will come in and feed for a long period of time, trying to dig up every last morsel of food. So for example, hemp seed, maize and tiger nuts are 3 of my favourite particle baits. They all have their sort of different specialities, maybe you could say. For example, maize. It's very bright, it's the cheapest type of particle, and you can afford to feed lots of it without it costing the earth. Hemp seed is amazing, it's crunchy, the fish love eating it. It's very, very small, so it gets stuck in the silt. So if you're trying to clean a certain spot on the bottom of the lake and get the fish really rooting around, digging the silt away so it becomes a clear spot which you can present rigs on, putting hemp seed out is going to be a great way to do that. And then there's tiger nuts. Tiger nuts are the most resilient particle bait. A hair-rigged tiger nut, or 2 or 3 tiger nuts, will stay on your rig for a really long period of time without falling off. Also, tiger nuts tend to avoid the attentions of small fish like roach or bream, whereas many other baits will get nibbled away and stolen by small fish. Tiger nuts, they're hard, they're crunchy, and it just seems like bream, tench, roach, rudd, they're not so keen on them. There's 2 ways to buy particle baits: in tins or jars where it's been ready prepared. It's already been soaked, boiled and potentially had attractants added to it. However, that is a more expensive way to buy them. And the alternative is that you go online to a bulk animal food supplier, or you go to a large pet store or farm supply store and you buy big sacks of these particles dry. It's much, much cheaper to do it this way. You can get maize, for example, for 50p a kilo dry, and once you've prepared it, i.e. soaked it, boiled it to make it ready for the fish to eat, you end up with a lot more bait than the cost that you've actually spent buying it dry. If you're curious about why you need to prepare particle baits and you want to know exactly how to do it, I've got a video on this channel. I'll link it down below. It's called, I think, How to Prepare Particles for Carp Fishing. Definitely worth checking out if you're thinking about doing like a heavy pre-baiting campaign and investing in particles. Moving on to pellets. Now, pellets will have originally been designed and invented for feeding animals and feeding fish in fish farms. However, they make a great bait for carp fishing too. One thing I'll point out before we get into the different types is that a pellet of any sort, and pretty much any size, will be adored by bream. You take bags of pellet to a fishery with lots of bream in it and you are inevitably going to find those bream, which is great if you love catching them, but if you prefer to get through to the carp, I'd probably avoid pellet if your local venue has large shoals of bream. Now, like I said, there's 2 types of pellet: high oil content, which are like oily, full of protein, very fatty pellets, and then you get the low oil variety, which is a lot more digestible to the fish and a better option if you're fishing in the winter when the fish's metabolism has slowed right down and when you want something that those carp can digest and poop out more easily, or else you're going to fill the fish up too fast. The high oil ones, however, are an amazing attractor, especially in coloured water and in warm water. The warmer conditions break down the pellets quicker, they release the oils, they release the attractants more fast because of the higher water temperature, and in general are a better, more potent bait than the low oil variety. I tend to find adding pellets to a spod mix can work very well, especially if you're fishing somewhere which has got quite a high stock of carp, potentially carp that have been introduced from a fish farm. I'll spod these out, I'll add them to a bait mix which I'm throwing in the margins, but probably the place where these pellets come into my fishing the most is with PVA bags. Because they're dry and you get a mixture of sizes, they tuck inside a bag very easily, be that a solid PVA or mesh bag. Top that off with a bright pop-up and you've got the perfect setup for a quick bite. Here we have ground bait. This is a powdered bait which, when mixed with water, goes into a consistency which you can sort of squeeze into balls or potentially squeeze inside a feeder or wrap around method feeders. This stuff, whether you're throwing it in the edge or putting it in a feeder or even cramming some inside like a PVA bag, it does the same thing. It clouds the water, small particles dissipate and draw fish into the zone. It's full of scent, it's full of flavour, but it doesn't fill the fish up very much. There's no real food in there to fill those fish up, so they keep digging for it and keep looking for it. Ground bait is quite an underrated bait in my opinion, and whether you're going for lots of small carp or fishing for big uns, sticking some ground bait in your mix can be a good bet. Similar to ground bait is paste. Ground bait squeezes into balls, but you couldn't really put it on the hook. Paste, on the other hand, whether you make it by soaking pellets in hot water until it goes really tacky and solid, or if you just buy ready-made pastes, is a more tougher, sticky bait which you can wrap around your hook, or you can squeeze around your lead, or even just throw out into your swim. There's just something about paste which carp really seem to love. I also use paste when I'm barbel fishing, and it's an absolute winner for that. But this video is about carp baits, so we'll move on. Within this fridge is a selection of live baits, so maggots, casters and worms. In general, these baits come into their own in the winter months, when the small fish, like roach, perch, rudd, are less active. The reason for this is because if you were to fish with maggots, for example, on a lake with lots of roach in the summer, those roach are so active and hungry, they will destroy your bait and basically give the carp no chance to get to it before the bait is gone. So these are more so, for me, baits that I use in the winter months. Let's start with maggots. Maggots can be hooked straight onto your hook and free-lined. They can be super glued to a piece of foam and used on top of a zig to give it a little bit of movement. Maggots can also be used in PVA bags and fish just on a normal hair rig or a maggot clip. I've actually got a video on the tutorials channel all about how to best use maggots in your fishing, because they are an integral part of many people's carp angling. Next up, you've got casters. Casters are what maggots look like once they've got a little bit further towards becoming flies. They're like a chrysalis, and they're sort of crisp and crunchy on the outside with like juiciness on the inside. I'm not saying that from experience having eaten them, I've just observed them. Because they don't wriggle, they're slightly less attractive to small nuisance species, and I mean, carp really like them. They're quite expensive though for what they are, so I tend to go more towards maggots, but on some places a very subtle presentation of 2 or 3 casters super glued to your hair rig with a small hook can be a great way of tripping up those very wary carp that don't seem to want to feed on anything big or brightly coloured. Below the maggots and casters are some tubs of worms. Now, worms are, for me, one of the best, most natural baits to fish for carp when you're stalking. So if you see carp bubbling in the edge, or you see them cruising around in the weeds, there's nothing more natural to present to them than a worm or a bunch of worms slipped onto a hook. I love using worms for free lining and stalking, but also equally they work great if you're fishing them on a maggot clip, hair rigged, or potentially just slipped onto the hook when you're float fishing. Now we've had a look at a whole load of different baits so far, but the main drawback of most of them is that small fish can also take those baits and get them in their mouth. So how do you avoid those small fish and make sure that when you get a run, it's a big carp? This is where boilies come into play. Boilies are a man-made bait, normally made out of eggs, flour and a few other powdered ingredients, then rolled up, dropped into boiling water to make them firm, and you end up with these perfect little circles which are easy to feed at long distances. They go out well in a catapult, and they also tend to deter small fish. For example, a bream is going to find it very difficult to get a 20mm boilie in its mouth. So you can almost guarantee that when you catch carp using large boilies, they're probably going to be a bigger average size, and when you're getting lots of bites, you're less likely to get those smaller ones. On smaller places where the fish are maybe more pressured and a little harder to catch, you can crumble up boilies, crush them, make them smaller, feed them so you get the maximum attraction, and the fish keep grubbing around trying to eat them for longer. There are different sizes and flavours available, however I prefer to just get confident using one boilie that I really like, and that is the cell boilies that I've got here. There's tiny ones, there's big ones, it all depends on the size of the fish in the lake you're fishing and how many smaller species are in there. So when you're feeding boilies, you'll probably want to use a boilie on the hook, and simply taking one out of the bag and slipping it onto the hair rig will work just fine. But what if you want to use a bait that's up off the bottom, like on a zig rig, or if it's weedy, maybe a choddy? Well, that is where pop-ups come into play. These are basically just boilies, but with some slightly different ingredients so that they float. These can be used on the surface when you're surface fishing as a hook bait, and also on any manner of different carp rigs to enable a presentation where your bait is actually up off the bottom. I often find when I'm feeding a big bed of boilies that a pop-up in the middle of it just sits up in front of the fish's face a little bit better, and sometimes gets you quick bites, especially if you use a brightly coloured pop-up over a bed of more drab boilies. However, if those fish are really wise and definitely aren't going for the bright one, maybe you need to switch to a darker colour so it matches the other baits that are in your swim. Then there's wafters. This is sort of a halfway between a sinking boilie and a pop-up. A wafter would be used potentially on a rig with a PVA bag when you really want that bait to fly up into the fish's mouth and you don't want the weight of your hook to hold the bait down on the bottom. Some people use wafters quite a lot in their fishing. Me personally, not so much. The next thing that I can see here is all manner of different liquids. Oil-based liquids and water-based liquids have been used in carp fishing for a long time to add more flavour or attractant to the bait. It's not something I use a huge amount of, but if you're mixing up a spod mix and you really want as much pulling power as possible to draw those carp into your area, maybe you want to buy yourself like some syrup or some liquids that are going to add more smell to the water and draw the carp in. Now there is one more bait that isn't really a bait, and that is artificials. Thank you, Cal. This is plastic sweet corn. Why on earth would you put a piece of plastic on your hook? We've just looked at so many different baits that are actually edible. Why would you use something that the fish can't actually digest? Well, this is because in some cases, if you're on a lake with crayfish, or in France, for example, you've got these poisson-chat, which is like a catfish which will just destroy and nibble away at anything you put on your rig. A piece of plastic sweet corn, or a plastic tiger nut, or a fake plastic boilie is more resilient. It's going to stay on your rig for longer and give you more chance of catching the carp. It's important to mention that this isn't being digested by the fish. They're not actually eating it. It's just being mounted on your hook. This has been an absolute whirlwind whistle-stop tour of all of the baits that I could possibly think of for carp fishing. I hope you've learned something. Maybe you don't want to confuse yourself by using too many different types, but amongst these baits, I'm sure will be something that will work for you. It will be within your budget and you'll catch carp on it. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Fishing Tutorials.